I was never the kind of person who believed in stories about life after death. To me, those accounts were nothing more than hallucinations, wishful thinking, or the brain firing off its last confused signals before shutting down for good. I had dedicated my entire life to science, to logic, to understanding the world through reason alone. The idea of an afterlife was as absurd to me as fairy tales. I had debated religious believers, written papers dismissing supernatural experiences, and prided myself on my unwavering skepticism. But then it happened. A massive heart attack, sudden and violent, right in the middle of my lab. I remember the sharp pain, the way my vision blurred as I hit the floor, the muffled shouts of my colleagues as everything around me faded. But here's what still haunts me to this day. There was no gradual descent into unconsciousness, no fading to black. One moment, I was in my body, and the next, I was outside of it, looking down at myself. I felt nothing. No pain, no weight, no heartbeat, just a chilling, undeniable awareness. I was still me, but I wasn't there anymore. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that my brain was distorting reality in those final moments. But the clarity was too sharp, too real. I could see every detail, the way my body lay lifeless on the cold tile, the panic on my colleagues' faces, the beeping of machines as someone shouted, "For help!" But the strangest part? I wasn't just seeing it, I was understanding it all at once, as if time itself had unraveled and everything was happening simultaneously. I didn't just witness them trying to revive me, I felt the futility in their actions, the sheer distance between the living world and where I now existed. It was like watching something familiar from the other side of an unbreakable glass. And that's when I realized something even more terrifying. I wasn't alone. I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense. It wasn't like there was a person or a figure standing near me, not at first. It was more like a presence, something vast and overwhelming, something that was aware of me in a way that made my very existence feel small. I wasn't supposed to be here. That thought hit me like a cold blade. Whatever was happening, whatever this place was, I knew instinctively that I wasn't meant to linger. And yet I couldn't move, or rather I had no body to move. I simply was, suspended in this weightless, formless state where time and space felt meaningless. And then without warning, I was pulled. Not by hands, not by force, but by something deeper. It was like gravity, but not physical, a force that yanked me towards somewhere else. I had no control over it. It wasn't like floating in a dream or being carried by the wind. It was more like being ripped from one reality and thrust into another. The lab, my colleagues, my own lifeless body, they vanished. Everything became absence. Not darkness, not void. Absence. I have no words for what it felt like because it wasn't simply the lack of something, it was the absence of everything. But I wasn't alone in it. Something was waiting ahead. I couldn't see it, not with eyes, but I could feel it. A consciousness, an intelligence, something so incomprehensibly vast that my mind recoiled at the very recognition of it. And then, suddenly, I was somewhere, not in the way we understand place or space, but in a way that I knew I had arrived. And that's when I saw him. I don't have the words to explain how I saw him because I wasn't seeing in the way I had in life. It was as if my very being perceived him, as if his presence was imprinted directly onto my awareness. And yet, I knew who he was, not because of any physical resemblance to the religious images I had dismissed my whole life, but because the very essence of his presence was undeniable. Jesus Christ. I had spent my entire existence rejecting the very idea of him, reducing him to myth, to religious symbolism, with no grounding in reality. And yet, here he was. He wasn't light, but he was light. He wasn't a man, yet he was a man. He wasn't speaking, but I heard him. And what I felt in that moment wasn't comfort. It wasn't peace. It was something deeper, something that unraveled me. For the first time in my existence, I wasn't standing on the foundation of my own knowledge. I wasn't the scientist, the skeptic, the man of logic. I was nothing. just raw being, stripped of every preconception, every belief, every illusion I had ever clung to. There was no place for denial, no room for argument, because in his presence, truth wasn't something to be debated. It simply was. And in that overwhelming flood of understanding, I realized something that sent a deep, soul-crushing terror through me. He knew me, not just my name, not just my face, not just the things I had done in life. He knew me in a way that no human being had ever known me. Every thought I had ever had, every secret, every rejection, every moment I had mocked those who believed in him. It was all laid bare, and yet there was no wrath, no hatred, no punishment, just truth. And then I understood, not through words, not through explanation, but through direct knowledge, the kind that doesn't come in sentences or ideas, but as instant, absolute knowing. There is one sin that will never be forgiven. Not murder, not cruelty, not even rejecting God in ignorance. The only sin beyond redemption is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. I didn't know what that meant at first. I thought sin was about actions, about morality, about the choices we make. But this was something different. This was knowing the truth and deliberately rejecting it, not out of doubt, not out of misunderstanding, but out of willful defiance. And as that realization seeped into every part of me, I felt something colder than death itself, because a question I had never asked myself now became the only question that mattered. Had I done it? Had I, in all my arrogance, in all my certainty, crossed that line? Had my entire life of denial and mockery already sealed my fate? The weight of that question crushed me. It wasn't fear of punishment, it wasn't fear of suffering, it was something infinitely worse. The fear of being separated, not cast out, not condemned by wrath, but cut off by my own choice, by my own refusal to see what had been in front of me all along. I felt that separation now, in a way I had never imagined possible. It was the absence of something I had never known I needed until that very moment. And the worst part? I didn't know if there was anything I could do about it. I felt something deeper than fear. It wasn't the terror of being in danger or even the fear of death itself. It was the suffocating, all-consuming realization that I had spent my entire life walking in the wrong direction, and now I was at the edge of a precipice with no way back. I wanted to plead, to ask if I had already gone too far, if I had already crossed the point of no return, but I didn't have a voice, not in the way I used to. My thoughts weren't private here. They weren't buried under layers of logic and self-deception. They were open, exposed, as if every part of me had been turned inside out for him to see. And the silence that followed wasn't indifference. It was finality. It was the weight of a truth that had existed long before me and would exist long after me. And then, just as suddenly as I had been pulled into that place, I felt something shift. The force that had drawn me here was changing. I wasn't being dragged deeper, but I wasn't being released either. I knew this was not my time to stay. But that knowledge didn't come with relief. It came with dread, because if I was being sent back, then that meant this experience wasn't meant to be my ending. It was meant to be my warning. A part of me wanted to fight against it, to cling to this moment and demand answers, to ask what I was supposed to do now. But there were no words, no instructions, no guarantees, just the overwhelming sense that what had been revealed to me would never leave me. And then I was falling. Not physically because I had no body, but in the way one falls through a dream, where time loses meaning and space doesn't exist. There was no tunnel, no fading lights, no comforting return, just instant transition. 1 second I was there, drowning in the weight of that truth, and the next I was gasping for breath, back in my body, back in the world I had always known. The first thing I felt was pain, a crushing, burning sensation in my chest as my lungs dragged in air like I had been suffocating for hours. I was lying on a hospital bed, my skin clammy with sweat, my hands trembling violently. Machines beeped around me, a nurse shouted something, but none of it felt real. The room, the people, even my own body, it all felt less than what I had just left. behind. I remember someone telling me I had been dead for several minutes, that they had almost lost me. I barely heard them, because in that moment nothing mattered, not my survival, not the relief of the doctors, not even the reality of being alive again. The only thing that mattered was the knowledge now burning in my mind, the memory of what I had just seen, and the horrifying, inescapable question that would now follow me for the rest of my life. Had I already? Damn myself. In the days that followed, I barely spoke. How could I? How do you begin to explain something like this? How do you put into words an experience that defies every known law of reality, every assumption you've built your life around? I didn't just have a near-death experience. I had seen something that made my entire existence feel small and irrelevant. I had faced the one truth I had denied my whole life, and now I was left to live with it. The doctors were pleased with my recovery. They called it a miracle, but I wasn't relieved. I wasn't grateful. I was haunted, because no matter how much I tried to push it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been brought back with knowledge I was never supposed to have. At night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt myself drifting, not into dreams, but into reminders. The presence I had felt, the weight of that truth pressing down on me, the unspoken finality that had wrapped around me in that place. It wouldn't leave me. I had never been religious. I had never believed in judgment, in sin, in anything beyond the tangible world. And yet, here I was, terrified of something I had once laughed at. I kept telling myself that I was given another chance, that if I had truly been beyond redemption, I wouldn't have been allowed to return. But what if that wasn't the case? What if I had already chosen my path, and coming back was just another part of that consequence? What if I was already lost, and I just hadn't reached the end yet? I began reading everything I could find on near-death experiences, searching for someone, anyone, who had seen what I had seen. But the more I looked, the more I realized how different my experience was. Most people spoke of warmth, of love, of being surrounded by light and peace. They talked about being embraced, about feeling a sense of belonging and comfort. But I had felt none of that. I had felt truth, cold, absolute, inescapable truth. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood why it had been shown to me this way. I hadn't been someone searching for God. I had been someone rejecting him, not out of ignorance, not out of confusion, but out of pride. I had been shown exactly what I had spent my life denying, and it had left me shaken in a way I could never put into words. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell myself it was just the brain misfiring, just a hallucination, just some chemical process creating the illusion of meaning. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew what I experienced wasn't something my mind could have created. It was too real, too sharp, too precise, and even if I could convince myself otherwise, the weight of it wouldn't leave me. It clung to me, gnawed at me, whispered to me in the quiet moments when I was alone. I hadn't come back unchanged. I had come back with something branded into me, and the worst part, I didn't know what to do with it. I stopped going to work. I couldn't focus. Every part of my life suddenly felt like an illusion, like I'd been sleepwalking through a meaningless existence for years, and only now had been shaken awake. I would sit for hours, staring at the wall, replaying every second of what happened, the way I was pulled from my body, the way time twisted and folded around me, the way he knew me. I started to wonder if I had already been judged, if my life had been nothing more than a countdown to a fate I had unknowingly sealed. It was unbearable. The weight of it was suffocating. I wanted answers, but the only answer I had been given was finality, that single, dreadful revelation. There is one sin that will never be forgiven, and I couldn't stop asking myself, had I committed it? I tried to tell myself that there had to be more, that I had to be missing something. I considered seeking out a priest, a theologian, anyone who could tell me what I was supposed to do. But the thought of speaking those words out loud filled me with dread. If I said it, it became real in a way I wasn't ready to face. And what if they told me what I already feared, that I had gone too far, that I had already damned myself, and all that remained was waiting for the inevitable? That was the true horror of it. I wasn't afraid of death anymore. I was afraid of what came after, because I had seen it, and I couldn't go back to pretending it wasn't there. Nights were the worst. I would wake up gasping for breath, heart hammering, drenched in sweat. But it wasn't nightmares that haunted me. It was something else, a feeling, a presence, a lingering knowing that pressed against me like an unseen force in the dark. I would lie awake for hours, afraid to close my eyes, afraid that if I drifted too far into unconsciousness, I might not wake up again. And if that happened, if my body failed again, I wasn't sure where I would go. Would I find myself back in that place? Would I be pulled even further? Or had I already been given my one and only chance, and next time there would be no return? I started losing weight. I barely ate. I barely spoke. The world felt distant, less real than the place I had been pulled into. How do you go back to normal life after something like this? How do you walk into a grocery store, pay your bills, engage in small talk when you've seen what's waiting? I couldn't talk to anyone about it, not just because I was afraid of what they would say, but because I knew no one would understand. How could they? They were still living in the illusion. They still had the comfort of ignorance, but I had been torn out of it, thrown into something too vast, too terrifying, too irreversible. And now I had to live with it. I started avoiding mirrors. It sounds ridiculous, but every time I caught my own reflection, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The man I had been before that day was gone. He had died on that lab floor, and whatever had come back wasn't the same. There was something hollow in my eyes, something missing. I used to be confident, assured in my beliefs, grounded in science and reason. Now, I couldn't even trust my own mind. Every time I looked at myself, I felt a creeping sensation, like I was being watched, like something on the other side of that experience was still aware of me, like it hadn't let me go. Maybe it never would. I stopped working, stopped answering calls. Friends and colleagues assumed I was recovering, but I wasn't. I was unraveling. The weight of what I had seen crushed me a little more each day. It wasn't just the memory of it, it was the knowledge. I hadn't come back with faith or hope. I had come back with a warning, a truth I could never unlearn, and that truth haunted me more than any ghost or nightmare ever could. I thought about writing it down, documenting it like an experiment, breaking it into logical parts to make sense of it. But what would I even say? That I had seen something beyond this world, that I had felt something greater than anything science could explain? No one would believe me. I wouldn't have believed me. And yet, the more I tried to push it down, the more it clawed its way to the surface. I began replaying my entire life, every decision, every word I had ever spoken against the idea of God, every moment I had dismissed faith as superstition. Had I crossed the line without even realizing it? Had I sealed my fate long before my heart ever stopped? That was the question I couldn't escape. If I had done it, if I had committed the one sin that could never be forgiven, then what was the point of anything now? What was I supposed to do with the time I had left if nothing I did could change what was waiting for me? I stopped reading about near-death experiences. None of them were like mine. No tunnels of light, no reunions with loved ones, no overwhelming love or peace, only truth, cold, absolute, unchanging. I envied the ones who had seen the light, who had been embraced, who had come back with messages of hope. But that wasn't what I had been given. I had been given a reckoning, and the worst part, I still didn't know if I had been given a second chance or just a final confirmation of where I was already heading. Days turned into weeks, but the weight of it never lifted. If anything, it grew heavier. I had tried everything to distract myself, mindless TV, aimless walks, even drowning myself in research, but nothing worked. The moment I was alone with my thoughts, the same questions circled in my head like vultures. Had I gone too far? Was I already lost? I kept thinking back to the moment when I had felt that separation, that terrible, absolute finality. It wasn't punishment. That was what scared me the most. It wasn't about anger or wrath. It was simply truth. A truth that didn't bend, didn't negotiate, didn't make exceptions. A truth that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. I thought about seeing a priest, but the idea filled me with dread. What if they told me what I already feared? What if they said there was no coming back from what I had done? I wasn't ready to hear that. I wasn't ready to have my worst fear confirmed. So instead, I kept it inside, carrying it alone, letting it eat away at me like a disease with no cure. And the strangest part? I started feeling something different in the air around me, a kind of awareness, like I wasn't alone, even when no one was. There. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a presence I could describe in words. It was just there. Watching, waiting, and then the dreams started. If I could even call them that. They weren't like normal dreams, the kind that fade when you wake up. These were different. I would find myself in that same weightless state, that same absence, as if I had been pulled back to the edge of whatever I had seen. Sometimes I would hear voices, not human, not understandable, but voices nonetheless. Other times it was just silence, the same suffocating emptiness I had felt when I was dead. The worst nights were the ones where I saw him again, not in the warm, reassuring way people describe, but as a presence standing just outside my understanding, still watching, still knowing me in a way I could never escape. I would wake up, gasping, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that I had almost gone back. I started questioning reality itself. Was I really alive? Had I really come back? Or was I still there, trapped in some in-between state, doomed to drift in this endless cycle of doubt and fear? I stopped telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I knew better, because no matter how much I tried to move on, to pretend life was normal, something was different. It wasn't just what I had seen, it was what had stayed with me, like a mark burned into me. Something invisible but inescapable. I had been changed, and no matter how much I wanted to go back to the way things were before, I knew I never could. I started avoiding sleep. The more I drifted off, the more I felt myself slipping, like my consciousness was being pulled towards something I didn't want to see again. It wasn't just nightmares, it was something deeper. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same awareness pressing in, like I was being watched from beyond a veil I couldn't break through. And yet some nights it felt like that veil was thinning, like if I wasn't careful, I would wake up in that place again. The thought terrified me. I would sit awake for hours, exhausted but unwilling to surrender to sleep, because in my gut, I knew it wasn't just my mind tormenting me. It was something real, something waiting. I tried to drown it out. I turned on the TV at full volume, let podcasts play in the background, filled my space with noise, just to keep my mind from wandering. But it didn't help. The silence found me anyway. It found me in the quiet moments, in the spaces between distractions, in the way my own reflection in the window seemed foreign, unfamiliar. I started to feel detached from reality, as if I wasn't fully here anymore, as if some part of me had been left behind in that moment of death, still hovering on the threshold, still caught in the grip of whatever had seen me that day. And then something happened that shook me to my core. I was standing in my kitchen one night, staring at the floor, lost in thought, when suddenly my vision shifted. For a fraction of a second, I wasn't in my kitchen. I wasn't anywhere. It was just a flicker, a glimpse. But I knew what it was, the void, that absence I had felt before. It was like I had stepped toward it without meaning to, like it was still there, waiting just beneath the surface of my perception. My heart pounded so violently, I thought I was having another heart attack. But no, when I blinked, I was back. Just my kitchen, just the dim light of the stove clock, just the unbearable weight of knowing that whatever I had seen had never left me. That was the moment I realized something horrifying. Coming back hadn't saved me. It had only made me aware. I wasn't free of it. I wasn't being given a second chance to live in blissful ignorance. I had seen the truth, and now I had to carry it with me. Maybe forever. Maybe until the next time my heart fails and I don't get another return trip. That thought lingers in the back of my mind every single day. Because if I had one certainty after all of this, it was this. I am not the same. and I will never be the same again. I stopped trying to pretend I could move on. It became clear that whatever had happened to me wasn't something I could push away, explain, or rationalize. It wasn't a temporary state of mind. It was part of me now. I carried it like a weight in my chest, something unseen but unbearably heavy. I avoided people. Conversations felt hollow, meaningless. The world kept turning. People kept living their lives, worrying about work, about money, about things that no longer felt real to me. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but how could I? How do you explain that you've seen something no one is supposed to see, that you felt a truth so absolute that it shattered everything you thought was real? I started walking late at night when the streets were empty, when the air was still and heavy. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked, as if moving might help me escape my own thoughts. But they followed me everywhere. Every step felt like I was walking towards something, though I didn't know what. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at the sky, searching for something I couldn't name. Other times I would stop in the middle of the street, overwhelmed by the sensation that I was being watched. Not by people, not by cameras, but by something else, something that had already seen me and was still seeing me now. I tried reading scripture, not because I had suddenly become religious, but because I was desperate. I needed to understand what had happened to me, what I had seen, what I had felt. But the words didn't comfort me. If anything, they terrified me more. I read about the unforgivable sin, about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, about those who reject the truth when it's revealed to them. And that's when the real horror settled in. What if that's what I had done? What if my entire life had been one long rejection? And now I had simply been shown the consequence of my own choices. The thought paralyzed me. I had always believed that knowledge was power, that understanding the truth set you free. But this truth didn't free me. It bound me. It left me staring at my reflection, wondering if I was already lost. I don't know how to live with this. That's the simplest way to put it. I wake up every morning with a pit in my stomach, knowing that one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, I will have to face it again. I will have to return, and I don't know what's waiting for me on the other side. I don't know if I'll be pulled back to that same presence, that same truth, that same finality. The people around me don't notice the change. To them, I'm just a man recovering from a medical event, a scientist who had a brush with death. They don't see the weight I carry. They don't hear the whispers in the silence. They don't feel the knowing that presses down on me every second of the day. But I do, and I know deep in my core that my life will never be the same again. I've thought about sharing my story before, but every time I get close, something stops me. Maybe it's fear that people will dismiss me as delusional, as someone who suffered a trauma and is just trying to make sense of it in irrational ways. Or maybe it's something deeper. Maybe it's the feeling that I'm not supposed to talk about this, that what I saw, what I felt, wasn't meant to be understood by the living, that it was a glimpse into something final, something irreversible. And yet, I can't keep it inside anymore. I feel like it's consuming me, like the weight of it is pressing down harder every day. I need to tell someone. Even if no one believes me, even if people laugh it off, I need to say it out loud. Because pretending I can ignore it hasn't worked. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know if this is something I'll carry for the rest of my life, or if there's some kind of resolution waiting for me that I can't see yet. But I know one thing. This wasn't just a hallucination. This wasn't just the random misfiring of a dying brain. It was real, more real than anything I've ever experienced, and that's what makes it so terrifying. Because if it was real, then everything I thought I knew was wrong. Science, reason, logic, none of it prepared me for this. None of it can undo what I saw. And if that place, that truth, that presence exists, then so does the consequence of rejecting it. Some nights I try to convince myself that I still have a choice, that maybe this wasn't a sentence but a warning, that maybe the reason I came back was because I can still do something about it. But what? I don't know how to undo a lifetime of denial. I don't know if it's even possible. The only thing worse than not knowing the truth is knowing it too late. And that's what haunts me most of all. The thought that I spent my entire life running in the wrong direction, and now I don't know if I have the time to turn back. So why am I writing this now? I don't know. Maybe part of me hopes that someone else has been through this, that someone else understands. Maybe I just don't want to feel so alone in this anymore. Or maybe I'm writing this because deep down, I know I won't be able to escape it. I don't think this experience was meant to fade. I think it was meant to stay. And I think one day when my heart fails again and there's no coming back, I'll finally understand why. If this story impacted you in any way, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Share this with someone who needs to hear this, and let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support helps this content reach more people.